guys, HigheverRains here. This week's mini-meta video was set to kick off the series on Dwarven tags, but while digging through my research I actually ended up finding some really interesting links that form the basis of the following theory. So rather than presenting the tags today, I felt many of you might appreciate this theory instead, so we'll be back next week with the mini-meta descriptions. This week I present the origins of Dwarven provings. Dwarven provings are an ancient tradition where champions battle one another for the right to claim they have the favour of the ancestors. Proving matches themselves are limited to those of caste, but anyone with a caste can participate and challenge anyone else to a proving in order to reclaim their honour and settle disputes, from the highest lords to the lowest servants. The tradition itself dates back to before Orzammar, when the grand provings were held in Kalsharok. Both Orzammar and Gundar featured their own proving grounds, and given Kalsharok, Gundar and Orzammar make up 3 of the 4 largest kingdoms, it's reasonable to expect that Hormak probably did too, not to mention the remaining 12 great kingdoms. Since Orzammar did not become the capital of the Dwarven kingdoms until surface trade with Tevinter began, back in -1170 Ancient, and at this time provings themselves were well established in Kalsharok already, these seem to be more than simply an ancient tradition predating the First Blight. In fact, we have evidence that they were popular among crowds in the Tevinter Imperium in -1200 Ancient, which is almost 1,000 years before the First Blight began, and a grand proving arena was constructed in Minrathous itself. The tradition of provings are old, very old, and the question then becomes just how old. The Dwarven tradition of naming paragons dates back to at least the time of Endrin Stonehammer and Orsek Garal, paragon kings who were responsible for moving the capital to Orzammar in the first place. Endrin Stonehammer is widely identified as the first paragon. If the stories are correct, and we cannot discount that they are not given what we know of the tampering of memories by the Shaperit, then the tradition of the provings predates the tradition of paragons. Paragons are described as living ancestors. The dwarves are forever looking backwards, a culture and society, at least in Orzammar, dedicated to the maintenance of honour, of caste, of tradition, and the old way of life. The greatest honour is to be named a living ancestor, a living representation of the past. The dwarves, again at least in Orzammar, truly consider their greatest days behind them, and the most noblest of pursuits is to rejoin that magnificence of the past, to reclaim all that was lost. This predates the Blights. All that was lost which should be reclaimed therefore predates even contact with Tevinter and the beginning of trade, since Endrin and Orsek moved the capital to Orzammar in order to improve upon newly fledgling trade arrangements. Since the Dwarven kingdom really grew with the rise of the Tevinter Imperium and the beginnings of surface trade, and since the golden age of the Dwarven kingdom was between this time and the First Blight when all the Taigs were lost to the Darkspawn, whatever the dwarves are seeking to reclaim was lost even before this. Their greatness was not their empire, but what existed before. The ancestors they seek to honour and respect and emulate predated the Dwarven kingdom itself. What then do they seek to reclaim, if not the height of the Dwarven kingdom? The answer, however nebulous and vague, lies deeper in history, and deeper in the Dwarven psyche, and has everything to do with the Dwarven link to the stone itself. We learn from the events of descent that the true children of the stone are the Titans, and that the Titans themselves are the original shapers of the earth. At some point the dwarves were connected to the Titans, though that connection was somehow severed, and vague references throughout ancient half-forgotten lore seems to suggest that this was linked to Mythal, though there is very little real proof and only a suggestion, primarily from the torn notebook in the Deep Roads Section 3 codex that we see in Trespasser. What the connection between the dwarves and the Titans was actually matters little for the topic at hand, however, because we do know, without doubt, that the Evanuris were involved with the dwarves at this time, and that they actively hunted the Titans, the pillars of the earth, thanks to codices like the Veilfire runes and the Deep Roads from Trespasser, the Old Elven writing from the Temple of Mythal, and the Song to Elganon. Whatever events of the past, the Evanuris was somehow successful in subjugating the Titans, and the visages we see of Mythal in the Bastion of the Pure in the Descent DLC, or throughout the Lyrium mines in Trespasser, make it very clear that following this victory, the Evanuris were venerated by the dwarves as well, though whether this was a willing worship or a forced one is unknown. What we do know is that whatever did occur changed the dwarves completely, and they did lose much of what had once connected them to everything they were. We see evidence of this in the way Dagna will report her research on the Fade, describing herself as mountain tall and thinking all the thoughts. We also see this in dialogue from Kieran hosting the Spirit of Othemiel when he speaks to a Dwarven Inquisitor, when he says, "You can't be taller without the Titans." We get even more from the ever-cryptic Cole when he says again to a Dwarven Inquisitor, "The stone, still there, silent and reaching up for the blood that walks. No dreams with the cord cut. You sell it." The ancestors then are those that did not have this cord cut, those who still thought of all the thoughts, who were taller, mountain tall, the original children of the Titans, and linked to the real shapers of the stone. So the act of provings is an interesting one. Its origins, if the stories are true, place it sometime before the rise of paragons, and certainly before the connection to Tevinter. Assuming again that our vague ancient timelines are accurate, the last of Elvenon died out with Arlathan around -1000 ancient, shortly after the dwarves in Tevinter entered into trade arrangements. The Dwarven kingdoms only began to grow after Elvenon itself was diminished, and this slow descent of the elves contrasting the rise of the Dwarven kingdom and Tevinter Imperium does appear to be consistent with the lore from what we hear about the last days of Elvenon from the likes of Abelas, both in his dialogue at the Well of Sorrows and in a codex called Untranslatable Elven Writing obtained from a Veilfire rune in the Temple of Mythal, which appears to have been made by him. In other words, Elvenon existed as a power over the dwarves up until the rise of trade with Tevinter, though its power was waning. And this means, since the provings predate Tevinter, that the provings themselves can only come from one of 2 points in history, the ancient days of the Titans, or the reign of the Evan-Uris. It becomes easy to see which when considering just what the provings themselves are, contests to win the ancestors' favour. If these contests existed during the time of the Titans, there would be no need for an appeal to the ancestors. In truth, a dwarf connected to the Titans, capable of thinking all the thoughts, would not necessarily need to sit and defend themselves in a contest of arms against his brethren. There would be no need to defend one's honour or try and win glory, so it quickly becomes apparent that provings themselves are a product of the time spent ruled by the Evan-Uris. And this holds out with some contextual evidence. We know the Evan-Uris were vindictive and spiteful. We know they had conflicts and wars. Solus in the Temple of Mythal will speak to Mythal's defeat of Falun Din, and Andril was said to have been defeated by Mythal after bringing back Armour of the Void, according to another Temple of Mythal codex, the elven god Andril. We have instances of the Evan-Uris fighting the Forgotten Ones from the story of Fen'Harel in the Tree, told in the Masked Empire, and the Evan-Uris fighting the Forbidden Ones as proved by the Vedathara Codex, Exile of the Forbidden Ones. We know as well that Mythal herself was deeply involved in the affairs of the dwarves from the prevalence of statues of her throughout the Deep Roads in both Descent and Trespasser. We never, interestingly, come across statues of the other Evan-Uris down there, except perhaps a few golden wolves here or there, but the presence or absence of other statues proves very little about the other Evan-Uris' involvement in all this, with so much lost in the Deep Roads. The fact that this is Mythal, though, is very important. While she may or may not have been alone in acting, we do know that she herself was involved in the affairs of dwarves, and while we do not know exactly what she was doing in the Deep Roads, we actually do not need to know in order to consider Mythal's role in the general sense. Mythal is justice. Solus describes her as merciful but protective and fierce. Morrigan says accounts conflict, and this holds true with other parts of the lore, as to whether she's vengeful or imbued with a motherly kindness. One thing has always held true, though. In matters of contention, Mythal was the arbiter, and she has been and always was the one appealed to for judgment and justice, and sometimes that judgment came not by appeal, but by the sword, as seen in the Codex, the Judgment of Mythal. This is not mere story. Accounts in the Vedathara corroborate this role, and one in particular is interesting to note, the Vedathara Codex, Jewel of 100 Years, which reads as follows. The pages of this book, Memory, show a narrow plateau on top of a mountain. 2 armoured figures, one in gold, one in black, are fighting in the snow. Steel flickers so fast the air hums, blood dots the ground. They do not stop for breath. The one in black makes no sound as a blade parts his throat. Mythal, in her wisdom, interceded in an argument between Elgenon and Falun Din. With clever words she convinced them to settle their grievance through a battle of their champions. Elgenon and Falun Din agreed, and set their champions against each other, rather than declare war among the gods. May those nights long be remembered, and Mythal's wisdom be praised. And it is here that we make the connection. It was Mythal who imposed this test of arms, who engendered an historical record that a fight to the death would soothe wounded pride. It was Mythal, arbiter of justice, who made this match, and its outcome, a sacred undertaking. The Dwarven provings take place on sacred ground. They are overseen by the eyes of the ancestors themselves, ancestors that represent the dwarves as they once were, mountain tall, with all the thoughts, possessing magic and might, connected to the titans who were capable of challenging the might of Elvenan itself, until the HigheverRains waged their bloody wars. In the aftermath of those wars, the Dwarven culture was formed, and from it some of its oldest traditions, and the basis of paragon and ancestor worship, and the ever-desperate drive to regain all that had been lost. A Dwarven culture linked to titans has no need for bloody proving matches dedicated to the honour of all that had once made them great, but the HigheverRains certainly did, and often engaged in such fights themselves, which ultimately led to the murder of Mythal and the formation of the Vale. As with much in the world, time has left its mark, shaped the dwarves into their own culture as the centuries pass by, and the grand provings that take place in Orzammar are a far cry from mountaintop snowbound battles between champions, or the subjugation of Andruil by Mythal. And yet they maintain the elements of glory, pride and honour. They are the final judgment, the path to justice, and their proceedings are among the most venerated of traditions to the dwarves, so much so that Orzammar has specific rules governed by the Assembly specifically for the purpose of keeping such engagements sacrosanct, and the involvement of a casteless dwarf is considered a defiling of its sacred constitution. This was no holdover from the time of the Titans, but its origins are old, older than one might first conceive, and from a far different source than the stone. Thanks guys, that's it for me. If you enjoyed this video, please check out the other options on my channel. Thanks especially to my Patreons, without whom videos like this would not be possible. If you want to support me on Patreon, there's a link below, and also check me out on Tumblr for additional theories and thoughts. Thanks!